The sea is calm. Too calm. Western Pacific, late 1944. A moonless night presses down on a narrow stretch of ocean south of the Japanese home islands. Somewhere below the surface, a steel hull moves slowly, deliberately, its engines reduced to a whisper. Inside, the air is thick with oil fumes and sweat. Men stand barefoot on cold metal decks, listening, not with their ears, but with instruments. A blip appears on the radar screen, then another. Cargo ships, unescorted, heavy with fuel, food, and raw materials. At periscope depth, the submarine's captain raises his lens. Through the glass, silhouettes slide across the horizon, black shapes against darker water. These ships are not warships. They carry no guns meant for battle. They carry the lifeblood of an empire. Within minutes, torpedoes are away, silent, invisible. Explosions tear through steel hulls. Fire blooms briefly, then vanishes beneath the waves. One by one, the ships slow, list, and disappear. Hundreds of miles away, Japanese naval officers will read the reports with disbelief. Losses they cannot replace, routes they thought secure, an enemy they underestimated. This moment did not come suddenly. It was the result of years of assumptions, miscalculations, and a quiet war waged beneath the surface, one that would strangle Japan long before Allied soldiers reached its shores. The origins of that silent collapse lie far earlier in how the world and the war arrived at this point.
Long before American submarines prowled the Pacific, Japan's empire was already afloat on a fragile foundation. Japan was not a self-sufficient nation. It never had been. By the 1930s, the Japanese home islands depended on the sea for survival. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, iron ore from Malaya, bauxite from the East Indies, rice from Southeast Asia. Even basic foodstuffs crossed thousands of miles of open ocean before reaching Japanese factories and cities. Every major military operation Japan planned required merchant ships to function first. Geography made this unavoidable. Japan was an island nation that had built an empire stretched across half the Pacific. From Manchuria to New Guinea, from the Philippines to Burma, its conquests were separated not by borders, but by water. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood how to fight battles at sea, but it never fully accepted that protecting commerce was just as important as destroying enemy fleets. This imbalance shaped everything. Japanese naval doctrine before the war revolved around the idea of the decisive battle. The belief was deeply rooted. The U.S. Navy would steam west across the Pacific, and Japan's fleet would destroy it in one climactic engagement. Submarines, under this doctrine, were not economic weapons. They were scouts and ambushers, meant to weaken enemy warships before the final confrontation. Merchant shipping barely registered in this vision. When Japan went to war in December 1941, this blind spot was already institutionalized. The Navy invested heavily in battleships, cruisers, and carrier aviation. Escort vessels, destroyers designed specifically to hunt submarines, were fewer in number and often assigned elsewhere. Convoy systems existed in paper, but were poorly enforced in practice. Early success reinforced these assumptions. In the first months after Pearl Harbor, Japan expanded with breathtaking speed. Hong Kong fell, Singapore surrendered, the Philippines collapsed. Oil fields in Borneo and Sumatra were captured intact. Japanese merchant fleets surged across newly conquered waters, hauling raw materials back to the home islands almost uncontested. To Japanese commanders, the sea lanes felt secure, too secure. American submarines were present, but ineffective. Reports from 1942 described U.S. torpedoes running too deep, failing to detonate, or veering off course. Sinkings were sporadic. Merchant captains often sailed alone, without escort, because there seemed to be little risk. Shipping losses were viewed as manageable, an acceptable cost of war. This bred complacency. Japanese leaders believed their anti-submarine capabilities were sufficient. Aircraft could patrol coastal waters. A limited number of escorts could handle any threat that emerged. Most importantly, they believed American submarines would focus on warships, not freighters. That assumption would prove catastrophic. Behind the scenes, Japan's shipping situation was already strained. The empire's merchant fleet had been stretched thin by rapid expansion. Ships were old, crews were overworked, replacement construction lagged behind operational demands. Yet warnings from civilian shipping officials and some naval planners failed to gain traction inside a command structure dominated by surface warfare priorities. The Japanese Army and Navy further complicated matters by competing for shipping resources. Supplies meant for one front were diverted to another. Convoys were delayed. Ships waited in ports, vulnerable, while bureaucratic disputes played out. Each delay increased exposure to attack, though few yet realized it. By late 1942, cracks were beginning to show. Fuel deliveries fluctuated. Industrial output dipped unpredictably. Some distant garrisons received supplies late or not at all. Still, these were logistical inconveniences, not strategic alarms. What Japanese commanders did not yet grasp was that a transformation was underway beneath the Pacific. The U.S. submarine force, once disorganized and hamstrung by faulty weapons, was learning, adapting, and preparing to strike not at Japan's fleet, but at its arteries. The sea lanes that had once carried the empire's expansion were about to become its greatest vulnerability, and the enemy was already positioning itself to exploit that weakness.
In the early months of the Pacific War, the United States submarine force was a weapon in name more than in effect. On paper, it looked formidable. Before December 1941, the U.S. Navy possessed one of the largest submarine fleets in the world. Modern boats, well-trained crews, commanders who had spent years studying undersea warfare. Yet when war came, results were dismal. The problem was not courage or intent, it was failure, systemic, technical, and doctrinal. American submarines entered combat carrying the Mark 14 torpedo, a weapon plagued with defects. It ran deeper than set. Its magnetic exploder detonated prematurely, or not at all. Contact pistols failed at oblique angles. Submariners reported perfect firing solutions followed by silent misses. Others watched torpedoes strike enemy hulls and bounce off harmlessly. At first, these reports were dismissed. Bureaucracy in Washington and at the Bureau of Ordnance insisted the torpedo worked as designed. Submarine commanders were told their calculations were wrong. Their crews were blamed. Meanwhile, opportunities slipped away. Japanese merchant ships survived attacks they should not have. But combat has a way of forcing truth to the surface. By mid-1942, frustration boiled over in the Pacific Submarine Force. Commanders began conducting unauthorized tests. They adjusted depth settings. They disabled magnetic exploders without approval. Slowly, evidence mounted that the problem was not the men, but the weapon. Leadership changes accelerated the shift. Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood took command of Submarine Force Pacific Fleet in early 1943. Lockwood was a submariner by instinct and experience. He trusted his crews, he listened to their reports, and he confronted the torpedo issue directly, demanding fixes when others had denied the problem.
By late 1943, the Mark 14's flaws were largely corrected, reliability improved, confidence returned. At the same time, American boats received improved radar, better fire control systems, and enhanced communications. Submarines could now detect targets at night, on the surface, long before being seen themselves. Doctrine evolved alongside technology. American submariners abandoned the idea of focusing primarily on warships. They began targeting merchant shipping aggressively. Tankers, cargo vessels, transports, anything that carried fuel, food, or raw materials became a priority. Patrol areas were reassigned to chokepoints, narrow seas and straits through which Japanese shipping had to pass. Night surface attacks became common. Submarines used darkness and radar to approach convoys at high speed, firing torpedoes from close range before slipping back beneath the waves. Japanese escorts, often undertrained and poorly equipped for anti-submarine warfare, struggled to respond. Intelligence played a role as well. U.S. codebreakers had begun to penetrate Japanese naval communications. While not perfect, this intelligence helped guide submarines toward high-value routes and convoys. Submarine patrols became more focused, more lethal. Sinkings rose steadily. By early 1943, the change was undeniable. Japanese merchant losses began to climb, not in dramatic spikes, but in a steady, grinding pattern. A tanker here, 2 freighters there. Each loss seemed manageable in isolation. Together, they formed a slow hemorrhage. Still, Japanese commanders did not fully understand what was happening. Reports filtered in from shipping companies and port authorities, but the scale of the threat was obscured by distance, bureaucracy, and denial. The decisive battle had not yet occurred. The fleet still existed. Therefore, in the minds of many, the war remained controllable. Below the surface, however, the war had already entered a new phase. American submarines were no longer a nuisance. They were becoming a system, methodical, persistent, and increasingly deadly. The weapons were working, the crews were experienced, the targets were vulnerable, and the pressure on Japan's maritime lifelines was only beginning to build. That pressure would soon be felt, not just in shipping manifests and tonnage reports, but in the lives of those sailing and sinking along those routes.
For the men inside American submarines, the war was intimate and relentless. Patrols lasted weeks, sometimes months. Crews lived in narrow compartments where bunks were shared in shifts and fresh air was a memory. Heat built constantly. Machinery vibrated through bone and steel. Every depth charge attack turned the hull into a drum, each explosion a reminder of how thin the barrier was between life and the ocean. Yet there was purpose in the monotony. Every radar contact meant a chance to strike at something that mattered. On the other side of the periscope, Japanese merchant sailors faced a different reality. Many were civilians or naval reservists, not trained combatants. Their ships carried cargo, not armor. When torpedoes struck, there was often no warning, only fire, smoke, and a rapid list toward the sea. Survival was uncertain. Lifeboats were scarce. Escort protection was inconsistent. Rescue, if it came at all, could take days. For those who survived, the knowledge followed them back to port. Each voyage was a gamble against an unseen enemy. As sinkings increased, fear spread quietly through the merchant fleet. Sailors understood what commanders did not yet admit, that the sea itself had turned hostile, and no amount of discipline could change that. American submarines did not win the shipping war through brute force alone. They won it through adaptation. Early patrols had been cautious, submarines submerged during daylight, attacking only when conditions were ideal. But as radar improved and crews gained confidence, tactics shifted. Commanders began attacking on the surface at night, using speed and surprise to overwhelm defenses. Radar allowed submarines to see first. Japanese ships, often without comparable equipment, were blind. A submarine could maneuver into position, fire torpedoes from close range, and withdraw before escorts understood what had happened. Patrol zones were chosen with care. Chokepoints like the Luzon Strait, the South China Sea, and waters around Formosa became killing grounds.
Ships had few alternatives. Geography forced them into predictable routes. Coordination improved as well. While not true wolf packs in the German sense, American submarines shared intelligence and patrol information, increasing coverage and reducing wasted effort. Each sinking refined the method. Each patrol sharpened the edge. Technology did not win the campaign by itself, but without it, the campaign would have failed. Radar transformed submarine warfare. It turned night into an ally and gave submarines initiative. Improved sonar and fire control systems increased accuracy. Communications allowed better coordination with intelligence sources ashore. Even small changes mattered. Better batteries extended submerged endurance. Improved periscopes reduced detection. Hull designs absorbed more punishment when depth charges found their mark. Most importantly, torpedoes finally worked. By 1943, the Mark 14 was no longer a liability. It detonated when it hit. It ran at proper depth. Submariners trusted their weapons, and trust changed behavior. Attacks became bolder, engagements closer. Japanese technology lagged behind in response. Escort vessels lacked advanced sonar. Depth charge tactics were often crude. Air patrols were sporadic and stretched thin across vast areas. The technological gap widened quietly, patrol by patrol, until it became an operational chasm. And as that gap grew, the impact on Japan's shipping became impossible to ignore, forcing even reluctant commanders to confront what was happening at sea.
Inside Japan's naval command structure, the evidence accumulated slowly and uncomfortably. Reports from shipping companies showed rising losses. Port officials noted delays and missing vessels. Fuel deliveries arrived short or not at all. Yet these warnings moved through layers of bureaucracy shaped by tradition and hierarchy. Few were willing to challenge assumptions formed long before the war began. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been built to fight fleets, not protect commerce. Escort duty was considered secondary, even unglamorous. Destroyers were pulled away for fleet operations. Convoy systems were inconsistently enforced, sometimes abandoned entirely to preserve speed. There was also disbelief. Many senior officers could not accept that submarines alone could threaten the Empire's survival. The decisive battle had not been fought. The fleet still existed. From their perspective, losses at sea were unfortunate, but temporary. Internal assessments underestimated the scale of the damage. Tonnage figures were incomplete. Sinkings were sometimes attributed to mines or air attack. The slow, cumulative nature of submarine warfare made it easy to misjudge its impact until shortages became visible on land. By the time some commanders began to understand the danger, options were limited. Escorts were too few. Anti-submarine training was rushed. Technology could not be conjured overnight. The system had been built for a different war, and it could not adapt fast enough. By the summer of 1943, the Pacific beneath Japan's sea lanes had become crowded with American submarines, not in numbers visible on maps, but in patterns felt through absence. Ships failed to arrive. Convoys returned incomplete. Tankers vanished along routes once considered routine. The U.S. submarine force had reached operational maturity. Crews were experienced. Commanders trusted their weapons. Patrol zones were no longer exploratory, they were deliberate. Boats were assigned to waters that Japanese shipping could not avoid: the Luzon Strait between Formosa and the Philippines, the South China Sea, the approaches to the home islands. Here, the campaign intensified. American submarines began sinking tankers at a rate that alarmed even cautious analysts. Fuel ships, slow and heavily laden, were ideal targets. Each tanker lost meant not just tonnage destroyed, but aviation grounded, ships immobilized, factories slowed. Commanders like Dudley "Mush" Morton aboard USS Wahoo, Eugene Fluckey of USS Barb, and Slade Cutter of USS Seahorse demonstrated how aggressive tactics could yield devastating results. Night attacks, close-range shots, repeated engagements in the same patrol areas.
Japanese escorts tried to respond, but they were overwhelmed. Many escort vessels lacked effective sonar, crews had minimal anti-submarine training, depth charge patterns were predictable and often poorly coordinated. Aircraft patrols were spread thin across vast distances, unable to maintain continuous coverage. The numbers told a story that words struggled to convey. In 1943 alone, Japanese merchant shipping losses exceeded 1.5 million tons. That figure did not include damaged ships forced out of service, nor cargo lost at sea. Replacement construction lagged far behind destruction. Japanese shipyards lacked raw materials, steel was scarce, skilled labor was increasingly diverted to military production. Still, there was resistance to panic. Japanese high command attempted incremental fixes, convoys were reorganized, some routes were altered, new escort ships were planned, but production timelines stretched into years the empire did not have. Emergency anti-submarine measures were introduced, often too late to matter. Meanwhile, the U.S. submarine fleet expanded. By early 1944, more boats were entering service. Patrols overlapped. Where one submarine left an area, another arrived. The pressure became constant. Merchant captains knew that even if they survived one voyage, the next was no safer. The impact rippled outward. Industrial centers in Japan began experiencing irregular fuel supplies. Refineries operated below capacity. Aircraft production schedules slipped. Training flights were curtailed to conserve aviation fuel. The Imperial Navy found itself rationing the very resource it had once captured at such cost. Japanese army units stationed across the Pacific felt the change as well. Supplies dwindled, reinforcements slowed, some garrisons received only a fraction of their required provisions. Hunger and disease followed isolation. What made the crisis especially dangerous was its invisibility. There was no single battle to point to, no dramatic loss that forced immediate reform. Instead, the damage accumulated quietly, ship by ship, convoy by convoy, until recovery became mathematically impossible. By early 1944, some Japanese officers began to recognize the truth. Internal memoranda warned of catastrophic shipping losses. Analysts projected fuel exhaustion timelines. Yet even then, the full implications struggled to break through institutional inertia. The submarines kept coming. Each patrol tightened the noose. Each sinking shortened the war not through conquest, but through subtraction. Japan's maritime empire was being dismantled not by invasion, but by erosion. And as the losses mounted, the question within Japan's command circles shifted from how to stop the bleeding to something far more ominous. How long can we continue at all? That realization would crystallize only when the figures themselves, cold, undeniable, were finally assembled and presented in full.
By mid-1944, denial was no longer sustainable. What had once been scattered reports and incomplete tallies were now consolidated into comprehensive shipping assessments. For the first time, senior Japanese naval planners were confronted with the full scope of what had been lost, not in anecdotes, but in tonnage, percentages, in projections. The results were devastating. Since the start of the war, Japan had lost more than half of its pre-war merchant fleet. In some categories, oil tankers most critically, the losses were far worse. American submarines were responsible for the majority. The sea lanes connecting Japan to Southeast Asia, once the arteries of empire, had been reduced to perilous gauntlets. Fuel was the clearest signal. Oil from the Dutch East Indies had been the strategic prize of Japan's southern expansion, yet by 1944, much of that oil never reached the home islands. Tankers were sunk faster than they could be built. Some never left port, lacking escorts. Others were rerouted along longer paths, consuming the very fuel they carried. The Imperial Japanese Navy felt the impact immediately. Fleet exercises were curtailed. Warships remained anchored to conserve fuel. Carrier air groups reduced flight hours, limiting pilot training and operational readiness. Plans that relied on maneuver and concentration of force became increasingly theoretical.
The army was no less affected. Factories lacked raw materials, ammunition production slowed. Transport ships meant to reinforce the Philippines, New Guinea, and island garrisons arrived late or not at all. Units once supplied monthly now received shipments quarterly if they were lucky. In some cases, supply vessels were sunk within sight of their destinations. Japanese countermeasures intensified, but they came too late. Escort production was accelerated, but crews were rushed through training. Anti-submarine tactics improved marginally, but coordination remained weak. Mines were laid in coastal waters, sometimes harming Japanese shipping as much as Allied submarines. Air patrols increased near the home islands, forcing U.S. boats to adapt but not retreat. American submariners adjusted calmly. They shifted patrol depths, approached from unexpected angles, exploited gaps in coverage. Losses occurred, but the operational balance remained firmly in their favor. The campaign was no longer experimental, it was industrialized warfare beneath the surface. Inside Japanese command meetings, the tone changed. Earlier optimism gave way to grim acknowledgement. Memoranda spoke of grave danger to national survival. Projections showed that even without further losses, fuel reserves would be insufficient to sustain operations into 1945. With continued sinkings, collapse was inevitable. Yet there was no single solution. Japan lacked the resources to rebuild its merchant fleet at the required scale. It lacked the fuel to escort convoys properly. It lacked the time to redesign doctrine or technology. The submarine threat had grown faster than Japan's ability to respond, and now dictated the tempo of the war. What shocked many commanders was not simply the effectiveness of American submarines, but how completely they had been misjudged. They were supposed to be auxiliaries. They had become executioners. By late 1944, the submarine campaign was no longer just one front among many. It was the silent determinant behind every strategic decision Japan faced. Every planned operation was constrained by fuel. Every defensive line was weakened by shortages. Every delay favored the enemy. The strangulation was nearly complete. What remained was to live with the consequences, on land, in the air, and across an empire that could no longer move what it needed to survive. Those consequences would soon become visible not only in reports and rationing tables, but in the fate of Japan's forces across the Pacific.
By late 1944, the effects of the submarine campaign were no longer confined to harbors and headquarters. They were everywhere. In Japan's industrial cities, factories stood idle for hours or days at a time. Fuel deliveries arrived sporadically. Coal and oil were rationed with increasing severity. Steel production declined as raw materials failed to arrive from overseas territories. Even when materials did reach port, inland transport struggled to distribute them efficiently. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once built around mobility and striking power, found itself increasingly immobilized. Major warships remained in port not because of enemy threat, but because fuel could not be spared. Sorties were planned and canceled. Training was cut to a minimum. Pilots flew fewer hours, eroding skills that could not be regained quickly. The fleet still existed on paper, but its operational value diminished with each passing month. In the air, the consequences were just as severe. Aviation fuel shortages forced commanders to prioritize combat missions over training. Replacement pilots arrived at the front with fewer hours than ever before. Aircraft production continued, but machines without fuel were little more than static symbols of strength. Even defensive air patrols around key shipping lanes were curtailed. Across the empire's distant garrisons, isolation became the defining condition. In the Philippines, New Guinea, the Solomons, and scattered Pacific islands, units once supplied regularly were now expected to survive on what they had. Food shortages became chronic, medical supplies ran out, reinforcements rarely arrived. Japanese soldiers dug in not because it was strategic, but because there was no way out.
Attempts to resupply by smaller vessels or submarines provided only marginal relief. These methods could not sustain entire divisions, they merely delayed the inevitable. Starvation and disease took a toll that enemy action often did not need to. Civilians felt the strain as well. Rationing tightened across the home islands. Urban populations endured colder winters and reduced diets. Transportation networks prioritized military needs, leaving little capacity for civilian relief. The war's cost was no longer distant, it was domestic. All of this traced back to the same source, the collapse of maritime logistics. The Japanese Empire had been designed to function as an interconnected system, with resources flowing inward and military power flowing outward. Once those flows were disrupted, the structure began to fail everywhere at once. American submarines did not occupy cities or capture territory during this phase. They did something quieter and more decisive. They made movement impossible. By the time Allied forces began advancing toward Japan's inner defensive perimeter, they encountered an opponent already weakened by scarcity. Resistance remained fierce, but it was increasingly constrained by material reality. The submarine campaign had not ended the war, but it had reshaped it irreversibly. And as Allied strategy adapted to this new reality, the consequences of Japan's strangled shipping would influence every major operation that followed.
As Japan's shipping network collapsed, the balance of the Pacific War shifted in ways that were both visible and invisible. Allied planners understood what the numbers meant. American submarines had done more than sink ships. They had hollowed out Japan's ability to respond. When Allied forces advanced into the Central and Western Pacific, they faced an enemy increasingly unable to reinforce, resupply, or maneuver. The results were felt from the Philippines to Okinawa. In late 1944, as U.S. forces returned to the Philippines, Japanese attempts to contest the landings were constrained by fuel shortages. Warships assigned to counterattack sailed with limited operational endurance. Air units lacked trained pilots and sufficient aviation fuel. Some formations existed only on paper, their equipment grounded or immobilized. The Battle of Leyte Gulf illustrated this reality starkly. Japanese naval units committed to the battle operated under severe fuel limitations. Tanker losses forced ships to sail with barely enough fuel to reach their objectives, sometimes not enough to return. The defeat that followed was not caused by submarines alone, but the strategic context that made the operation so desperate had been shaped by them. In the months that followed, the pattern repeated. At Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japanese defenders fought with determination, but isolation defined their struggle. Supplies dwindled quickly, reinforcements were impossible, commanders planned defensive battles knowing relief would never come. Even as Allied air power and surface fleets tightened their grip, submarines continued their work. Coastal waters around Japan became increasingly dangerous. Food shipments declined further. Industrial output dropped again. The margin for survival narrowed. From the Allied perspective, the submarine campaign validated a strategic truth. Economic warfare could decide outcomes that battlefield victories alone could not. By targeting logistics rather than armies, submarines had shortened the war by eroding Japan's capacity to fight at every level. For Japan, the lesson was brutal. An empire dependent on maritime lifelines could not survive without protecting them. The failure to prioritize convoy systems, escort production, and anti-submarine doctrine early in the war proved irreversible. By the time these weaknesses were acknowledged, the strategic window had closed. The strangulation of merchant shipping did not produce dramatic headlines during the war. There were no grand ceremonies or captured capitals associated with it. Yet its influence was everywhere, in ration books, in grounded aircraft, in abandoned plans. When Japan approached the final months of the conflict, its options were constrained not only by enemy action, but by the accumulated effects of years without adequate supply. The war's end would come through a convergence of factors, but beneath them all lay a quiet campaign that had steadily removed Japan's ability to choose its own fate. And when the fighting finally stopped, the significance of that silent war beneath the waves would only become clearer with time.
The campaign of American submarines against Japan was a war fought in shadows. No banners were raised, no cities burned by artillery. The victories were measured in steel hulls swallowed by the sea, in convoys that never arrived, in oil that never fueled engines. It was invisible, relentless, and absolute. For those on the surface, life continued as if the war were ordinary, but beneath them, the undercurrent of destruction was reshaping an empire. Japan had built a sprawling maritime empire without fully accounting for the fragility of its supply lines. The very sea that allowed conquest also became its executioner. The lesson is stark. Wars are not won by the largest ships or the fiercest battles alone. They are won by control of movement, of resources, and of opportunity. American submarines demonstrated that lethality need not be spectacular to be decisive. Precision, persistence, and adaptability, quietly applied, can strangle the strongest of adversaries. Yet there was human cost on every side. Sailors aboard merchant vessels, submarines, and warships faced danger daily. Civilians endured scarcity, rationing, and anxiety. The war beneath the waves reminds us that strategic decisions ripple outward, touching lives far from the planning room, far from the captain's conning tower. In historical perspective, the campaign reshaped modern naval warfare. It elevated submarines from auxiliary tools into strategic instruments capable of altering entire wars. It highlighted the vulnerability of logistics and the moral weight of economic targeting. And above all, it exposed a simple truth: an empire is only as strong as its ability to sustain itself, and the ocean is indifferent to pride, power, or ambition. The waters of the Pacific, once a conduit of expansion, became a crucible of collapse. And in the quiet, unheralded battles of those waters, the fate of nations was decided, not with a clash of fleets, but with silence, patience, and steel moving through the deep. The empire Japan had fought to build was undone not by fire alone, but by the invisible hand of submarines, silent predators, precise and inexorable, reshaping history from beneath the waves.